4. Operation Land Grab. With barely any resistance, Japanese troops silently invaded and took control over 2 of the Aleutian Islands in the cold Arctic near Alaska in 1942. They took 9 Americans prisoner on the island of Kiska on June 6th, and the next day they captured an American couple from Ohio and 45 native Aleuts on Attu. These 2 Aleutian Islands are so barren and remote that according to archaeologists, Attu only had about 5,000 residents in the hundreds of years before it was discovered by Russian fur traders. And even after they arrived, one Russian man stayed on the island for a full 7 years before another ship could take him home. By the time World War II came around, the islands were barely inhabited at all, but there was a growing fear of the Japanese in the Pacific, which prompted American territorial authorities to relocate the native Alu inhabitants to internment camps they'd set up in Alaska. Out of the 880 natives moved, 75 of them were killed by infectious diseases during the 2 years of internment. Unfortunately, the evacuees weren't the only ones who suffered. The US didn't bother to evacuate all of the civilians on the island. The 45 Alu natives and the American couple from Ohio were still there and were captured. When the Japanese took over the island of Kiska, they killed 2 men, captured another 7, and let one escape for a while. The man hid in a dark cave and survived by eating earthworms, which made him lose 80 pounds. After enduring 50 days of starvation in Kiska's frozen wasteland, the man, Senior Petty Officer William C. House, surrendered to the Japanese. The officer's Navy brothers had already been moved to Japan, and he soon followed them. Throughout World War II, they remained prisoners. The Japanese invaded the Aleutian Islands because General Higuchi Kichiro believed that if they controlled them, they'd be in control of the Northern Pacific. Kichiro wanted to stop offensive attacks on his country. He wanted to separate and create a boundary between the US and Russia in case Russia decided to join the Americans, and he also wanted to create air bases to launch offensive attacks from. On June 6, 1942, under the command of Colonel Yasuo Yamasaki, the Japanese arrived in Kiska, and after easily capturing the island, they invaded Attu the next day. The US wasn't able to bring in ground troops until after their victory in the Battle of the Komandorski Islands in March 1943. But they did carry out some minor bombing raids from other nearby Aleutian Islands that weren't yet taken by the Japanese. The US was ready to take action 2 months after Komandorski. On May 11, 1943, Operation Land Grab began, sending 11,000 17th Infantry soldiers, led by Major General Albert Brown, to the islands. The Americans landed at the south and north ends of Attu, and they made their way to Colonel Yamasaki's position on the island's high ground, further inland. They didn't face much human opposition, but the island itself proved a formidable foe. This wasn't simply a march, they were searching every nook and cranny for Japanese soldiers, and they were doing so in the harsh wind and snow. The Americans were wildly unprepared for the conditions. They didn't pack the right kind of clothing, and because they thought the mission would be simple, they didn't bring enough food to last for the journey. Many US soldiers suffered from gangrene and trench foot, and they quickly lost their physical strength and morale due to hunger and the extreme cold. More troops suffered casualties from the weather than actual battles. But miraculously, the exhausted, starving American soldiers were somehow able to push the Japanese to Shikogof Harbor, where they hid in underground dugouts or caves. This small victory gave the US the upper hand. On the morning of May 29, 1943, Yamasaki led his men on a banzai charge against the Americans. His plan was to charge on the US troops and take their artillery before returning to their cliffside caves and hideaways. Then they would wait until the Japanese Imperial Army sent them back. The Americans fought without weapons at first after being taken by surprise, but eventually they used their firepower, which left the Japanese with little to no chance of victory. But a few small groups of Japanese soldiers refused to give up, and they kept fighting until July. The battle left 1,000 out of the 15,000 American troops dead, and less than 30 enemy troops survived. Meanwhile, on the island of Kiska, the Japanese controlled their herd of the mass suicide on Attu. When more Americans that were better equipped with Canadian bomber assistance and airplanes arrived in August, They dropped bombs on the enemy and stormed Kiska from 95 ships filled with over 34,000 US and Canadian troops. They expected there to be about 5,000 Japanese soldiers on the island waiting for them, but in reality, they'd already fled Kiska back in July. Even though there wasn't an enemy, 200 Allied troops lost their lives in the Nun battle. Some of them were victims of friendly fire, while others had unfortunate run-ins with booby traps. Have you heard of any other crazy operations in World War II? Let us know in the comments below and subscribe if you've liked the video so far. 3. Foo Fighters. One night in 1944, Lieutenant Fred Ringwald with the 415th Night Fighter Squadron saw something in the sky that he couldn't identify clearly. He was riding as an observer in a fighter piloted by Lieutenant Ed Schluter, with Lieutenant Donald J. Myers working radar when the object was seen hovering over the hills of the Rhine Valley between Germany and France. The men saw 8 to 10 bright, fiery orange lights in the sky. But then, at a lightning-fast speed, they moved off the wing of the plane. The airmen checked in with Allied ground radar, but they didn't register anything. Believing the lights to be some type of German air weapon, Schluter readied the aircraft to fight. But as he did this, the lights vanished into thin air. At first, the men stayed quiet out of fear they'd be ostracized, but then the sighting started to spread throughout the rest of their unit. Near Breisach, Germany, on December 17, 1944, a pilot was flying at 800 feet when he saw flashing green and red lights hovering in a T-shape. The lights seemed to follow him, but they soon disappeared. Then 2 more flight crews witnessed similar lights on December 22nd. One crew near Hagenau reported seeing 2 in a large orange glow, rising from the earth to approximately 10,000 feet. The mysterious objects tailed the fighter for about 2 minutes before turning away. According to Keith Chester's Strange Company Military Encounters with UFOs in World War II, the UFOs appeared to be under perfect control at all times. Eventually, the lights were named Foo Fighters by the airmen, which was inspired by the popular comic strip called Smokey Stover. Multiple explanations for the anomalies were given by the press, including that they were just weather balloons or flares. But these claims were rejected by the members of the 415th Night Fighter Squadron, who maintained that what they saw had to have been some kind of UFO. 2. Elsbieta Strasberger. Elsbieta Strasberger lived through the Holocaust as a child. She shared her experiences from World War II as part of the National Days of Remembrance event that commemorated the victims of the Holocaust. This event is hosted by the Army National Guard. Elsbieta explained that on September 1st, 1939, the Germans came and she'd barely turned a year old when it happened. In just 17 days, her family's life flipped upside down. Her father, who was a physician, went on to serve in the Polish army as a result of the invasion since he knew he'd be useful. And, unfortunately, Elsbieta and her mother wouldn't see him again until well after the war. Her mum was only 27 when her husband left, and so they went to stay with Elsbieta's grandmother. For over 2 years, they lived in southern Poland. During that time, her mother went to work in a tailor shop while Elsbieta stayed home with her family. The Holocaust survivor said that as a young child, her grandmother gave her instructions on what to do if anything ever happened. There was a gazebo in the elderly woman's backyard, and Elsbieta was told to hide under the stone benches if she ever got scared. These instructions, as it turned out, were life-saving. On June 11, 1942, Elsbieta was walking with her grandmother when she was suddenly told to go under the benches. She didn't quite understand it at the time, but heading in their direction were 2 huge Germans, and while she was safe in the gazebo, that was the last time she ever saw her grandmother alive. Amazingly, Elsbieta and her mother stayed safe throughout the rest of the war by purchasing new Aryan papers, giving them non-Jewish identities. They stayed with another woman and her child for a while but moved to Czechoslovakia when the war was winding down. Throughout this time, Elsbieta had been told her name was Barbara, but before their move, her mother revealed her real name and told her she was actually Jewish. Her father was only someone she knew from vague stories, since she was too young to remember him when he left. But when he returned, he gave Elsbieta a gift she's kept with her ever since. at the National Days of Remembrance event. As she shared her experiences during the Holocaust, she showed off a 66-year-old doll, the gift her father had given her on that fateful day. 1. Japan's Death Ray. An entire gallery of new weapons was made during the arms race in World War II. Some of them came from the edge of human imagination, while others opened new perspectives on warfare. These weapons of the New Age were bizarre and created to be so powerful that they could win the war. Even though the leaders of the world based most of their power on conventional arsenals, they all worked in secret on possible futuristic weapons. In the years leading up to the war and in the years during the conflict, these powers began developing weapons of mass destruction. Some of them were brought to life, such as the atomic bomb, but others never saw the light of day. One of these weapons was the Japanese Kugo Death Ray. Interestingly enough, Japan's Death Ray has origins rooted in the States. Nikola Tesla, one of the most brilliant scientists of all time, was one of the first men to build a so-called Death Ray. He called his invention Teleforce, and it was designed to project microscopic electrically charged particles. There were actually no rays of any kind involved though. Tesla's weapon was complex and included multiple mechanisms to produce electricity capable of enormous force. This force required huge static power plants, which cost about $2 million each in 1940. Tesla claimed his invention would be capable of shooting down thousands of planes at once from a distance of 200 miles away. But Tesla's idea behind the Death Ray weapon was peaceful. Because of the machine's immobility and dimensions, Teleforce would only be used as a defense. He believed that such a powerful weapon would make wars futile. After presenting his plans to the League of Nations and the leading powers of Western democracy, he was rejected by the US Bureau of Standards, since they believed it wasn't possible to create such an enormous amount of energy. The British, on the other hand, tried to make their very own Death Ray, resulting in the development of radar. The Soviet Union also made an attempt to get Tesla's plans, but the weapon was never made. But what wasn't of interest to the Allies was of interest to the Axis nations. The New York Times and the New York Sun published articles about Tesla's Peace Ray, as they called it, on July 11, 1934, which caught the attention of Japanese news correspondents. The articles were then presented in Japan, and the weapon received public attention. As the country was preparing for war in the late 1930s, General Yamamoto was searching for a weapon to give him an advantage over the US. He sought out Yoji Ito, a prominent Japanese physicist from the Naval Technology Research Institute, for this purpose. After studying Tesla's design, Yoji came to the conclusion that it was impossible to create so much energy, so he and his team turned to microwaves instead. They'd already worked on magnetrons in 1940 as part of their radar research, when Yoji decided to make a larger, more powerful magnetron. This machine, codenamed Kugo, would emit a high-power beam of short radio waves that would either cause physiological or psychological issues to nearby enemy soldiers. $2 million was invested into the project by Japanese officials, which would have been about $500,000 back in 1940. General Tsuyoshi Kusaba was in charge of the project, and a brand new lab was built in the Shizuoka prefecture. They conducted experiments on car and airplane engines, and even on animals for nearly 5.5 years. In 1943, they proved that radio waves between the ranges of 78.74 inches and 22.62 inches could cause lung bleeding, while radio waves shorter than 78.74 inches could literally destroy healthy brain cells in animals. Based on their findings, Japanese scientists believed the machine could have similar effects on humans. The first prototype was built in 1944 by the Japanese radio company. In its trial period, the weapon killed a rabbit nearly 100 feet away in 10 minutes using microwaves. A groundhog took twice as long as the rabbit to feel the effects of the machine. While they seemed to be achieving what they wanted, the situation on the Pacific Front forced all research to stop. The project showed potential and could have eventually produced a death ray, but in 1945 the weapon was far from complete, and as far as anyone knows, the Japanese haven't finished building the weapon since. Which one of these stories from World War II did you find the most interesting? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed today's video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.